Joining us tonight to weigh in on the proposed 2026 national budget is UP School of Economics Assistant Professor and columnist JC Punongbayan. Welcome to the big story. May I call you JC?
Yes,
JC,
of course. Good evening, ladies.
well, it's still early days, of course, and this budget is very, very thick. But what is your initial impression of this proposal?
Yes, so I've had the chance to actually go over quickly some of the more important budget documents submitted today. And apparently, for example, there's still a huge fund for unprogrammed appropriations. Remember that this was a big issue last year in the 2025 budget because many budget allocations were put in unprogrammed or unfunded appropriations. In other words, these are line items in the budget that cannot be spent on without extra revenues collected by the government. So the problem is that in the 2026 budget proposal, unlaki, there's still a huge chunk of the funds of the budget that's still in the unprogrammed appropriations. So it seems that we haven't learned our lessons from last year. And then I've also got to look at the infrastructure budget. When you look at the National Expenditure Program, they kind of reduced the budget allocation for flood control projects compared to the budget for this year, and also expanded some of the budget for railways because many projects have been delayed already. But the problem is that this happens every year. So I'm worried about the further deliberations and how the budget will change further, especially with the BICAM.
Then this falls squarely on the DBM. Why still provide for this unprogrammed expenditures?
Exactly. So we have to scrutinize not just the lawmakers themselves who deliberate on the budget, but even as early as now, even in the first stage of the budget process, with the budget being proposed by the executive, because there seems to be some agreement or some quid pro quo between the executive and the legislature as well. So it seems this is part of an, well, I hate to say that it's a syndicate or something something so bad, but there's a pattern that we can see
Nagkakasunduan na
from the
sila na may
budget.
ganun talaga. We give you this leeway to add what you wish, something like that.
Exactly. So when you look at the flood control projects, for example, you will notice from the first budget of the Marcos administration, they do not reduce the amounts from the previous year's allocations. So what they do is either they match the previous year's allocations for flood control or increase that at the level of the NEP. And then it balloons once the budget deliberations begin and with the BICAM. So in other words, hindi lumiliit yung mga infrastructure projects, especially for flood control and for road networks. Kasi ito yung mga favorite na mga, na mga lawmakers natin. And of course, in cahoots with many contractors.
Well, but the zero budget for Auda somehow sends a signal also na are they being somehow, is this a small smack on them, on the hand?
Yes, well, I think they got a lot of heat with all of the Auda budget, especially in the 2025 budget. But you have to note that they kind of enjoyed already the spoils of the Auda this year because it is an election year. So they got to disburse lots of funds in the past year. So I guess they're trying to rein in because it's not an election year in 2026. So there's not so much need for Auda. So they can afford to be performative and say that there's no budget for ACAP, for example. But we have to note that it's not just ACAP. There's so many other programs. For example, AIX, you have the medical assistant for indigent and financially incapacitated patients, the TUPAD, and many other things that have been co-opted by lawmakers themselves. So we have to watch out for all of that as well.
How about PhilHealth? Did you get to check?
I haven't yet checked, but again, we have to watch out for, remember that the subsidies for PhilHealth were eliminated entirely for the 2025 budget. I'm not sure, I haven't really looked into it. I was just poring over the infra aspect of it. But yeah, we have to watch out for that because, of course, there's a Supreme Court case right now that hasn't been decided yet. But yeah, there are a number of court cases right now that pertain to the budget. And in my opinion, this need to be settled as soon as possible because it's another budget cycle, and we're talking about billions of pesos that could be potentially wasted.
All right, what about the five transparency measures put forth by no less than Speaker Martin Romualdez earlier? JC, I hope you caught that. He was, of course, proposing live streaming the whole process, involving the private sector as well as civil service organizations for their inputs, strengthened oversight, things like that. Are you hopeful that this is enough to curb, any magic that happens somewhere beyond public eyes?
Well, yes, it's a step in the right direction, but we have to watch out for the horse trading that happens before the BICAM actually starts. Because as we know, the lawmakers talk between themselves, the House leadership, the Senate as well. There are backdoor negotiations in the allocations for region-specific projects, for example, that are not necessarily going to be transparent once you live stream the actual BICAM meeting. So in other words, much of the interesting stuff actually happens off cam, if you will. So we need to kind of demand that the lawmakers actually go well beyond live streaming these events and actually provide us with, if possible, the details of the individual projects and what they intend to do with the budget of these projects.
I don't know, JC, if you caught Senator Sherwin Gatchalian. He's now, of course, a Senate Finance Committee chair, and he made some proposals also of his own. One of which is to digitize the entire thing. So he's saying now we only see the bill and then the final product, but everything in the middle, we don't really get eyeballs on. So he wants to put all of that online, and hopefully, there's people like you guys who will pore over each and every page, right? Will that be enough, you think, to at least triangulate or extrapolate where things went wrong and where things were added?
Yes, that will help, especially because of, for example, the budget approved by the House that's transmitted to the Senate, for example, and reconciled with the BICAM. The problem is, as you alluded to, all of these are in PDFs. There's no Excel sheet that can be easily examined. So it's a real constraint for everyone who wishes to scrutinize the budget. But I think beyond that, we need to also, as much as possible, look at how the budget evolves as frequently as possible, because many of the changes happen, for example, in the budget deliberations and also the BICAM itself. So I'm just a bit worried that maybe when all of these documents, for example, the BICAM version of the budget are published, many of the things that we need to watch out for have already been decided between the lawmakers. So in other words, it's too late for people to actually scrutinize or call out all of these things because the BICAM happens maybe in November of every year, and then the signing of the budget happens in around December. So things are moving fast, and I'm not quite sure that that's enough time for ordinary people like ourselves to actually scrutinize and debate transparency.
Well, JC, as of June 2025, the national government's total outstanding debt stands at 16.75 trillion. And for next year's budget, almost 978 billion is being allocated for debt servicing. In your opinion, how sustainable is that in terms of debt repayment? And what are the risks also associated with that?
Well, it's beginning to be alarming, to be honest, for economists, because beyond the absolute level of the debt, what we're looking at or what we're worried about would be the ratio of the debt to GDP, or otherwise known as the debt to GDP ratio. And as of June, because the latest GDP figures have been released, it's now up to 63.1%, which is higher than 62% back in March. So in other words, the debt to GDP ratio has been inching up actually in the past couple of months at a rather alarmingly fast rate. So we have to watch out for this because I think the debt now stands at 17 trillion pesos. A large part of it would be domestic debt. But as the Budget Secretary mentioned earlier in your report, there's very limited fiscal space. The deficit is about 1.5 trillion pesos last year, and that could be the same this year or even more. So unless the government, that kind of explains why the government is so eager to tax as many goods as possible without incurring the ire of Filipinos. What that signals is that there are in desperate need for money, but at the same time, I think one way to save on money would be to actually be prudent in spending. However, the flood control projects are still there, the road networks are still there. We haven't learned our lesson. It's more or less similar to what has happened last year, but we'll have to see how the BICAM actually.
Well, there are other ways to control floods than building infrastructure. It seems to be the favorite solution. But anyway, let's go to education as a percentage of GDP, and it has, is it like about 6%, wherein we want really the money to make a difference in the education sector? So,
exactly. So even if the government now allocates the lion's share on education, remember, number one, that there's an issue from last year because they kind of justify, because when you look at the combined budgets of DepEd, CHED, and TESDA, it still came short of the budget of DPWH. So in other words, they really poured money into DPWH last year, so much that it's more than 1 trillion pesos. And that kind of exceeded a bit the combined budget of those three big agencies. So what they did is they included in the budget, I guess they did a search, a control F search of all the institutes and schools, and then combined all the budgets there so that they can justify that education still has or still commands the largest share of the budget. Exactly. But we have to watch out for that again this year. And remember that this is also part of the one of the court cases. I think someone wants to clarify with the Supreme Court, how do we actually define the education budget or the share of education in the budget? Because there's no hard and fast rule for that. But at any rate, we still definitely need to spend more on education, specifically because our scores in math, reading, and comprehension and science are quite low. And based on studies, the lower you spend on a per pupil basis, the lower the scores you can expect as well. So we need to focus especially on spending per pupil because the student size or the number of enrollees are also is also growing. So we need to compensate for that by spending even more and also spending more wisely on education.
So do you mean, JC, because Secretary Pangandaman actually bannered earlier that for the first time, 4% of GDP is going to education? Again, I'm not sure kung basic lang yon or kasama yung CHED and TESDA. But she said that is the UNESCO benchmark, and for the first time ever, we actually made it. Is that enough, or should we, go a bit higher than 4% of GDP for education?
I think I saw some studies shown before that it's actually 6% of GDP. So I'm not sure it's 4. I will also have to fact check what the secretary said. But I think that requires a bit more time because we just received the budget documents it just got published.
We have a lot of fact checking to do, and this is a question I wanted to ask you: are there enough civil society organizations to really? It's going to be a tedious job para kang naging congressman na rin, diba? To go over this budget and to check on the people we elected to really be faithful to what they're saying.
So yes, I think there was some press conference or some event between some lawmakers as well as civil society organizations who are scrutinizing the budget. But I think we have to be wary of these events, or because we have to make sure that these are not only performative, because remember that the lawmakers themselves are the ones who actually approve the budget, including the dubious budget for 2025. And now they're kind of playing the hero
so
that they're actually...
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. At first, actually, I was quite puzzled by it. It didn't make a lot of sense that they're actually the ones who are actually scrutinizing the budget. They should scrutinize themselves, I think. I think it boils down to that. But civil society organizations, there are some efforts toward more budget scrutiny, but they have to be wary that their efforts are not co-opted or overshadowed by lawmakers as well.
Okay.
Well, JC, speaking of the word you used, performative, President Marcos in his SONA did warn that he will veto any bill that does not align with his proposed budget or the government spending plan. Do you think that will really influence how Congress shapes the budget, or is that just political theater?
Well, I think it boils down to the incentives faced by the lawmakers themselves, who are the ones who are proposing and inserting all of these dubious budgets for flood control, etc. I doubt very much that the president is totally ignorant of all of these shenanigans in the budget process, because at the end of the day, remember that he's the one who signs the budget, diba, by December. And he has the option of actually vetoing some line items that are dubious. Last year, I remember he kind of tried to reduce the budget for flood control projects because there was a bit of an escalation of scrutiny on flood control in particular. But that's a very small proportion of the flood control projects. If you add up all of the flood control projects that he approved, he signed off in the GAA since 2023, it already amounts to 1 trillion pesos, or almost 1 trillion pesos. So that's a lot of money. And needless to say, but yeah, I doubt that things will change dramatically this time around, because the lawmakers are in on it, and we face different incentives compared to people who want a sounder budget.
You sound very pessimistic. These are empty words that we've been broadcasting.
But speaking of pessimism, JC, let me just revert to Pawi's earlier question about debt servicing. So we're at about 63% debt to GDP ratio right now. Of course, the government says 60 is about a healthy level. But for you guys, for economists, what's actually really a true healthy level? Like, where would you want to see our debt to GDP ratio at?
Well, if you go back to Philippine economic history, back in the days of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, we were on the precipice of a debt crisis in the early 2000s, when the debt to GDP ratio exceeded 70%. So the debt to GDP ratio now is inching up. It's at 63%. Before the pandemic, it was at 39%. So ideally, that's the goal. We should be able to bring down the debt to GDP ratio well below, a bit below 40%. The goal in the first SONA of President Marcos is to bring it down below 60%, but we're going in the opposite direction because it is increasing. So we should be very wary about this development. And the main problem is that the economy is growing a lot slower these days. Right. Mm-hmm. It's harder and harder to achieve 6% growth, right, if you noticed. Nasa bandang 5% lang siya, yeah, in the past couple of quarters. So this slower growth will mean that the debt to GDP ratio, so it's harder to manage the debt, or the debt will really explode compared to the economy, or as the size of the economy, if the economy is slowing down. So it boils down to, how do we actually accelerate growth in the Philippines? That's a crucial way by which we can analyze the debt.
And finally, were you able to take a look at agriculture? Because this is also a cornerstone of this administration. It promises to increase agricultural productivity. Is there enough spending toward that and giving our farmers, a better lot?
Yes, unfortunately, I haven't really scrutinized the agriculture budget just yet. But based on past GAAs or budgets, a huge chunk of the budget for the Department of Agriculture goes to only rice. So that is a huge problem. We should diversify our agriculture here in the Philippines. There's too many rice-centric policies and programs. And if we want to boost the value of agricultural products, then we should diversify and begin to kind of focus, or to shift the focus away from rice, because agri-policy in the Philippines is too rice-centric.
Right. We thank you for your time, and wish you luck in scrutinizing the budget even more. That was Economist JC Punongbayan.